Welcome to the budget debate right here on the India Development Debate this evening. With less than 48 hours to go for the last budget of the Modi government, all eyes are on the finance minister, who will have to do a tightrope walk. For one, there is a fanning farm crisis, which has already cost the BJP quite dearly. The track record of the Modi government is not very impressive when it comes to employment generation either. The government is well aware of the fact that the twin problems have the potential to play the party pooper in a run-up to elections. On the other hand, there is not much bandwidth to go for big fiscal sops, considering the shortfall in indirect tax collections. Will the government go for populist budget, giving FRBM targets a miss? Can the centre afford to ignore the unrest in the hinterland? Will Piyush Goyal take the populist route to opt for fiscal, or will he opt for fiscal prudence? Many questions that will be answered right here on the India Development Debate this evening with top-notch economists. I'm Supriya Srinath, and joining me on this show are Sajjid Chinoy, Chief India Economist for JP Morgan, and Samiran Chakraborty, Chief Economist, India Citi Bank. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us. And Sajjid, if I may kickstart things with you, and there's obviously a political connotation to everything that's happening in this last budget. After the drubbing in the recent state elections and concerns about farmer distress, what is your broad expectation from the budget? Is agriculture going to be the center point of budget 2019?
I think that will be one of the key themes of the budget. I think, however, just to step back, I think there are some people in the market expecting a large fiscal slippage this year because GST collections have undershot. We're not in that camp. I think the government's tried to be very good about fiscal marksmanship in the last few years. We think they'll come, despite the revenue challenges, they'll come very close to meeting their fiscal deficit target of about 3.3% or stay very close to that. And I think as per the fiscal roadmap, they'll target some more consolidation next year. So I think to start with, that will be the overarching macroeconomic framework. And I think that will cause bond markets and markets more generally to heave a sigh of relief that at least at the central level, the government's committed to being prudent with the deficit. Now, in terms of what the themes will be, I think one theme will be agriculture. The terms of trade have moved adversely against farmers for many years. On the one hand, we celebrate low inflation, but that's come at the cost of exceptionally benign food prices, which is hurting farmers. I think the question, Supriya, really is, we all know that farmers need help. What is the most efficient and targeted way to help them? So to the extent that there is some farm income support, I think A, it's important that it is targeted because we just don't have the fiscal space for it to be anywhere close to universal. B, personally, I would like for it not to, any cash transfer, for example, not to be linked to a per acre or per hectare basis for two reasons. One is that's regressive. The larger farmers end up getting more, the smaller farmers get less. That's a regressive form of doing it. And secondly, ultimately over the next decade, we want to move people out of agriculture into higher value added manufacturing and services. So if you make any cash transfer or income support contingent on land holdings, that could distort the incentives to move out of agriculture eventually. Therefore, I'd rather it be a plain vanilla, use the socioeconomic caste census, look at the bottom 10, 20, 30% of households and have an unconditional cash transfer there. Presumably we test this, we have a pilot, we've got the financial backbone in place. That to me would be the way to do it. One final thing I'll say is, how do we pay for it? And I think here it's important that any income support ideally, be targeted, but ideally replace the less efficient, more leaky subsidy. So if we can achieve some combination of these principles, I think that would be a step forward.
No, I understand on, restraining the less leaking system, but Samiran, an additional agri package that's being spoken about will entail some cost, and there's no denying that. What happens to expenditure? I mean, isn't it a given that with no robust revenue streams in sight, spending will be slashed to stick to fiscal consolidation?
So when you look at the expenditure profile in last 5 years, the expenditure to GDP ratio has been brought down by almost 1.5 to 2% of GDP. And after doing that, now if you look at the profile of the composition of expenditure, what comes out is that almost 75 to 80% of the expenditure is extremely sticky. They are almost like committed expenditures on wages, pensions, interest payments, defense expenditure, capital expenditure. So the ability to switch expenditure is not that much there. And because we have already done significant expenditure compression in terms of almost 1.5–2% of GDP over the last 5 years, the space for expenditure reduction is that much lesser this time around. So we will have to really be quite bold in going after even things like fertilizer subsidy, etc., if we really want to trim down further on expenditure. So that makes the job of announcing a separate package that much more difficult.
Sajjid, no, I agree with you. And Sajjid, one of the things that the finance minister had said some time back, and I'm really referring to Mr. Arun Jaitley, and he had said some time back that agriculture is under stress, there is some amount of pain there, and markets will understand and comprehend a populist move from a rational move. Do you see that happening? Because I think while many will say and congratulate the government for being prudent in its tenure so far, if there were to breach, if there was to be fiscal expansion, will markets be forgiving? Will markets understand and be able to differentiate between what is populist and what is rational?
Well, markets are not always very rational, so it's hard to see what they will glean out of it. I think, the fact is, in the last few weeks, we have seen some pressure on Indian bond yields, despite expectations of a rate cut in the next few months, suggesting there is some fiscal nervousness. You saw that a little bit on bond yields. You've seen that a little bit on the currency as well in weeks gone by. But I think, again, the government's got a good track record on the centre's deficit. I don't think there'll be a major breach. I think the reason markets are nervous is not so much that it's the centre's fiscal profligacy. It's the fact that, state deficits have gone up, which is ultimately issuance that the market has to absorb. Public sector borrowings have gone up. Now, one could argue for good reason. They're financing capital expenditure, but it's issuance that markets have to absorb. So the fact is that we're in this situation, what I call a fiscal trilemma, where on the one hand, we want to reduce financial repression and bring down SLR ratios for banks, which is a good thing. On the other hand, we're justifiably wary of more foreign participation in the bond market, which is also understandable. But if you take these as a given, then if you run elevated public sector borrowing requirements, something has to give, and that something has been in the last few years a progressively steeper yield curve. So I think it's against this context that policymakers need to be cautious. I think some amount of small slippage for a well-targeted income support scheme that over time is going to replace existing subsidies, I think is understandable. But I think if there are large slippages and markets sense that there are new unfunded liabilities coming up at a time where GST collections are undershooting, that could lead to some nervousness.
Samiran, I don't know if you're going to be as forgiving. Do you believe the markets, some amount of slippage, the markets will take in their stride, given the purpose it's going to be done for, and that is agriculture, that is a sector that's under stress?
I mean, let's first talk about the bond market, because the equity market reactions are always somewhat different from the bond market reaction. So just to put the numbers out, even if the finance minister sticks to the FRBM targets, the gross borrowing for FY20 is going to be close to 6.7 trillion rupees, which is going to be the highest ever gross market borrowing. And on top of it, if you add the state's gross borrowing number, that's going to cross 12 trillion rupees, and on top of it will come the public sector companies borrowing from the market. So you are staring at something like close to 13.5–14 trillion rupees of overall borrowing just from the government side. That's not a great picture to look at. If on top of that there is a slippage of 30–40 basis points of GDP, what you are suggesting, that clearly will have a negative sentiment impact on bond markets. The bond markets are clearly not pricing in that large gross borrowing slippage. The equity market reaction perversely could be positive, because there is an expectation that this so-called rural stimulus will have an impact on sales of FMCG companies, auto companies, etc. So if the package size is meaningfully large, then we would not be surprised if equity markets takes it more positively and bond markets take it more negatively.
No, I think that's a very important point that both of you are making. Sajjid, of course, believes the markets will take it in their stride, and you're giving the rationale for this because some amount of steroids, some amount of stimulus for the rural economy is also good for equity markets because they're companies with rural exposure and they stand to benefit. But I don't think we can do a fiscal policy decision. We can discuss fiscal deficit without really focusing on what it does to our good friends at the RBI. And Sajjid, you know, inflation is rather benign. Growth has been very subdued, especially the factory output and all of that. And people just jump to the conclusion that the stage is set for a monetary policy loosening. You know, some amount of rate cut could be coming. How instrumental will, though, the fiscal position be to determine the monetary policy regime? Sajjid.
Well, it's certainly one factor that the MPC will keep in mind. But remember, we have a mandate now for monetary policy, which is to keep headline inflation, you know, close to 4% for the medium term. And the fact that food prices have come down so dramatically means that the last two inflation prints have been in the 2% handle. And over the next 6 to 8 months, what you see is headline inflation is expected to remain below 4%. And therefore, some in the market believe the MPC will have the data support to possibly cut rates either at the February review or the April review. We certainly think in February, the MPC will change its stance from calibrated tightening towards neutral. Our base case also is that we'll get a rate cut either in February or April, because I think it's important to be consistent with the mandate. The focus has squarely been on headline CPI, and that should remain the focus. And headline CPI, at least in the next 2 to 3 quarters, will be below 4%. So I think a rate cut in one of the next 2 meetings is perhaps expected. The larger point, however, is if you look below the surface, what you will find is growth is not as weak as some people fear. The fact is bank credit growth has picked up very smartly in the last few months. And if you look below the surface of the high frequency data, whether it's the PMI surveys or industrial production numbers, growth is actually holding up better than people thought. So I don't think India is on the verge of a big growth slowdown. There is certainly sectoral stress, agriculture, SMEs, but not for the larger economy more broadly. So given the fact that output gaps are closing, growth is holding up, and core inflation is between 5.5% or 6%, I don't think there is space for a large easing cycle this year. But will you get one rate cut over the next 2 meetings? I think so, given the trajectory of where headline inflation is expected to go.
You know, there's something interesting that you say that, and I remember Raghuram Rajan said this to me while I was in Davos, and he said in India, people are schizophrenic. When you want a rate cut, you say our growth is low, and then you want to just, thump your chest and say, we are the, highest growing economy in the world. But yeah, that debate set aside. Samiran, I do want to point out the monetary policy angle to you as well, and I think Sajjid is right. Core inflation is extremely sticky. High frequency data does point in the direction that things are picking up, capacity utilization has gone up, and I'm going to discuss that in just a bit. But what is your own take? I mean, how keenly will the men on Mint Street be watching what the government does in the budget? Could they slip? Could they be populist? Could they give in to crowd pleasing? How important an input, a benign inflation on one hand, slowdown on factory output on the other, how crucial an input is the fiscal announcement, the budget really going to be on monetary policy making?
So 2 aspects to answer your question. One is that the whole objective of this farm relief package, the final objective is clearly to have the food price inflation up to a level which is reasonable, because food price cannot stay in deflation forever. So the question in front of the Monetary Policy Committee would be that if such a package comes to increase the food deflation back to food inflation levels, what happens to overall headline inflation number in that context 6 months forward? So in our view, that can lead to a situation where the committee starts thinking that the inflation situation is not going to be as comfortable as it is today. And the second aspect is that there has been a growth slowdown in the last quarter or so. Whether the committee treats this growth slowdown as more transient, arising out of more financing constraints in the shadow banking system, or it treats it as a more longer lasting slowdown. Because if it is a longer lasting slowdown, only then a simultaneous use of expansionary fiscal policy and expansionary monetary policy can be justified. In our view, the space for monetary easing will be relatively limited if the fiscal slippage is meaningfully large.
No, I think we've talked about the fiscal space, we've talked about the monetary space, but let's talk about the revenue streams. And Samiran, I'll throw this to you and then of course go to Sajjid on this. And I think, you know, there are one-off items that you spoke about. There is Citi stake sale that can happen. There is also a very ambitious divestment target, 1 lakh crore. Now the reality is that last time around we got to such high numbers that we did unprecedented was because we had these ONGC, HPCL kind of deals. We now have a BOB sort of a deal in the pipeline, the PFC, the RECs of the world. Will markets though digest a revenue stream like these? Because these are not real divestment candidates. This is not real divestment that's happening. It's a good accounting practice, and many people will say the government is actually moving money from one hand to the other when it makes government entities do a merger like this or otherwise. Will markets be convinced of revenue streams like these?
Yeah, I mean, so divestment, the challenge has been that the equity markets in general, their appetite for large-scale public sector divestment also has not been that great. So let's face it that we had one good year in FY18 where the divestment numbers exceeded the budgeted amount. But every other year over the last 20 years almost, the budgeted numbers have always been overstated. There is nothing new in it. So this year also we are expecting a small slippage in the divestment revenue from the budgeted target of about 80,000 crores. So that is a perennial problem, and this problem, there's no real good solution to it because it's easy to say strategic sales, but strategic sales becomes quite tough in an environment where there are anyway a lot of assets coming up for sale under the IBC process. So the overall assets that are getting sold in the economy is humongous, and that choice, compared to that, the buyers are pretty limited. So that's why even strategic sales might not be an immediate solution to this problem.
Okay, fair point indeed. That may not be the immediate solution to the problem, but the immediate solution will be to get more pragmatic, realistic divestment targets. Sajjid, revenue stream is challenging. GST revenue has not stabilized. It continues to be wobbly. Divestment too ambitious, and like both Samiran and I believe, not real divestment, not real stake sale happening. How should divestment be made a more pragmatic revenue generating stream?
I think you've hit upon the two key challenges next year. That, you know, the good thing is the GST is becoming progressively simpler with every single GST council meeting. So simplification should help compliance, but we do need GST compliance to go up, and hopefully the government will focus on this post the election. I think also we need to take a kind of hard-nosed view about disinvestment, and the way to think about disinvestment, I think, is not to say we're selling our family silver. It's more to think of it like an asset swap. That on the government's balance sheet, we want to sell some assets which we think, you know, can be productively managed elsewhere, and use those resources to build crucial public investment with large positive externalities. I think if you take that view on disinvestment, you're really not constraining the balance sheet, you're changing the quality of the assets you hold. But I think those are two key focus areas over the next year.
I think we haven't addressed the elephant in the room for every budget making. And Sajjid, if I may take a quick follow-up with you, I think the oil math hasn't been spoken about. And you know, it shot up to levels of 80. A lot of people worried what it will do to India's mathematics. And I think on one account, this government has been absolutely lucky in its tenure, is where oil has been. And oil math, I'm presuming, has been very favorable and will impact the fiscal math in turn favorably too. Sajjid.
Well, I think, you know, oil coming down from 85 to 60 affects India across the board. It opens up a little bit of fiscal space. Number two, it is going to help growth because it helps increases purchasing power for households. It will reduce input costs and increase firm margins. So lower oil prices is a positive terms of trade shock for India. But I guess the larger point is, it's unfortunate that the macroeconomy is so exposed to movements in oil, and that the vagaries of oil prices in global markets have such an influence on our macroeconomic outlook. So what I've been arguing for a while is we should, like other emerging markets, start locking in oil prices by contemplating or considering hedging oil prices in global markets. Mexico does this. They're an oil exporter, and to reduce the fiscal uncertainty and the economic uncertainty, they've started hedging oil exports. What we need to do is create an institutionalized framework so we start hedging oil prices. I mean, if oil was at 50 and we had locked in prices close to 50 and 60, we wouldn't have gone through some of the volatility and the boom bust cycles and the pain that we saw last year when oil was 85. This is not to second guess future oil prices. It is to reduce uncertainty. So I would argue that over the medium term, just like we have to insulate ourselves from the vagaries of the monsoon with more irrigation and more insurance, we need to do the same thing with oil prices. There are mechanisms in global markets to hedge this, and India should, over the next 5 years, gradually create the institutional framework to hedge oil prices and reduce that uncertainty.
Okay, away from that, let's talk about the actually is yield in some sense. And I think the albatross around the government neck continues to be jobs. I know the budget can't move the needle on jobs per se, but Samiran, the job creation has to happen in the organized formal economy. Do you believe the budget can move the needle in terms of incentivizing industry, incentivizing the formal sector to create more jobs?
I think sometimes we put too much emphasis on the budget to solve all the structural macro challenges. So it's very difficult for the budget to address an issue like job creation. It requires a much more holistic approach, and it just can't depend on a 1st February announcement. In the past, the government has tried to incentivize industry for job creation by tweaking the PF rules, etc. But it has not worked in a big way, because I don't think it's just an incentive from the government which will address this situation. It's more structural in nature and has to be addressed, in my view, outside the budget.
Maybe putting in too much emphasis on the budget, but this is the big exercise that we track. And Sajjid, I'll come back to you and talk to you about private investment. Yes, capacity utilization has gone up, and that's great news for Indian industry, because capacity utilization should put the virtuous cycle in motion as far as private investment is concerned. What is it that the budget can do to spur up that?
No, I think the fact that capacity utilization has gone up is related to the earlier point I'm making, that if you look at where core inflation is and core prices are, it tells you that firms have some pricing power, which is good news, which tells us that growth is not as weak as we suspect, and that any NBFC shock is being quickly offset by bank credit growth. And the same message is coming through in the capacity utilization survey. So that's good news. It tells us that as utilization rates keep rising, private investment will be more likely to take place. And we've been waiting for a private investment cycle forever. So in the next 2 years, once the uncertainty of the budget and the election is behind us, as utilization levels rise, we should see more private investment. In that environment, what can the budget do? Well, I think the budget can, take the Hippocratic oath, which is do no harm, stick to your fiscal deficit limits, keep borrowing costs low, and make sure there's enough space in terms of domestic financial savings available to the private sector to invest, so that the private sector is not forced to borrow abroad. Because remember, global interest rates are rising and the global environment is becoming more murky. This is the last point at which you want India's private sector to take on dollar debt and all the risks that come with it. So I think the budget's role is stay fiscally prudent, growth is holding up, create enough financial saving space to facilitate a private investment cycle down the line.
Fair point. A quick last question, and I think, Samiran, we'll close it with this. Universal basic income, it was an idea that was floated in the economic survey. Thanks to the competitive political populism that we are going to see in a run-up to elections and the budget, it's now being spoken about in the political sphere as well. Will we actually see that debut in budget 2019?
I'll be a bit surprised if it comes so early because clearly universal basic income, even the way Arvind Subramanian had suggested it, it subsumed a lot of other subsidies and only then it could be rolled out. In my view, just 2 months before the elections, subsuming these subsidies might not be politically a very prudent idea, and that's why maybe this will require a bit of more pilots in different places to see whether this is working properly or not before it can be rolled out at a pan-India level. So I'll be a bit surprised. Our sense is that if a universal basic income is only provided for farmers, then the cost comes out to be about 0.5% of GDP, but a lot depends upon what is the amount of money that you think is the basic income. And last point will be that in a demographically young economy like ours, I am slightly more skeptical about universal basic income because it can have a detrimental impact on labor supply in general. And in a young economy, that's not a very good thing to have.
All right. On that note, completely timed out on this edition of the India Development Debate. This is the Budget Special Exclusive. Thank you very, very much, Sajjid Chinoy and Samiran Chakraborty, for taking time out and joining us. It is quite clear, and in fact, it's crystal clear what the economists make of this big budget exercise. In an election year, when there is, as it is, such a huge risk factor to markets and economy, stick to the non-hypocrite part of it, like Sajjid said. You've got to just deliver on what is expected, and that is stick to fiscal consolidation, ensure that budget is not going to be disruptive, ensure there is enough room and space for private consumption to take off, for private investment to happen. The idea is to put that virtuous cycle back in motion, and that's what Budget 2019 needs to do. Of course, all eyes on Finance Minister Goyal and what he does on the 1st of Feb. Thank you very much for being with us on this edition of the India Development Debate.